question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, Liar's Circus by Carl Hoffman. As someone who grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, Carl has a long history with PNP and our neighborhood. So we're especially delighted to be hosting him this evening. In fact, he was just at our Connecticut Avenue location earlier today saying hi. Carl's an avid traveler, a former contributing editor to National Geographic Traveler and Wired. He's visited something like 80 countries on various assignments. His several previous books, all narrative nonfiction, also have taken him all over the world. In Hunting Warbirds, he described the search for lost remains of US aircraft from World War II. In Lunatic Express, he went around the world on some pretty risky conveyances, including decrepit buses in Peru, overcrowded ferries in Bangladesh, and choked trains in India. In Savage Harvest, he immersed himself in the jungles of New Guinea to investigate what happened to Michael Rockefeller, who vanished in 1961. And in The Last Wild Men of Borneo, he told the stories of two very different adventurers, Bruno Manser and Michael Palmieri, who journeyed into the wilds of Borneo and with sharply contrasting aims and fates. For his new book, Liar's Circus, Carl stayed in the United States for quite another kind of exploration, one that took him deep into the American political landscape, in particular, Donald Trump country. As Carl says in the opening pages, after spending much of his career traveling the globe to understand cultures deeply unfamiliar to him, seeing the extent of support for Trump in the US made him feel nearly as apart as he felt sometimes among some foreign tribes. So over the course of several months, he attended 8 Trump rallies in 8 states, and he chronicles the experience as a way of understanding Trump's faithful base. The result is a timely, engaging portrait of Trump world that addresses the question frequently asked by many of those outside it, namely, who are those people? In conversation with Carl this evening will be Liza Mundy, a former Washington Post reporter who is herself the author of several books, including Michelle, a biography in 2008 of Michelle Obama, The Richer Sex, which explored the forces behind women's rising economic power, and most recently, the best-selling Code Girls, about female American code breakers during World War II. So Carl and Liza, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I just want to say before we do anything else, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to Politics and Prose. As Brad said, I actually grew up, this is really weird, I have to say, right here, I wish I could see everybody. I wish I could see all the people who are here. I know that Mrs. Hannibal maybe is out there, and Tim, and people who grew up across the street from me, and friends and family, and my kids, and you're all just invisible, but I appreciate you coming. And I actually grew up about not even a mile from about a half a mile from Politics and Prose. And when I was 16, I worked in the building briefly when it was Higger's Drugs before it moved to the corner, what's now the CVS. And before the advent of leaf blowers, I had to sweep that parking lot with a push broom every morning in the hot sun. So Politics and Prose is home. And I also want to thank Liza for doing this. It's a huge honor, and everybody should read Code Girls. It's a beautifully written book, story of women code breakers in World War II, but also on a much deeper level, it's about a portrait of this tectonic shift that took place really around World War II as women were brought into the workforce, not just as secretaries or assistants, but as mathematicians and language scholars and intellectuals and brains, and celebrating a change that is with us still. So thank you very much. I'm so pleased.
Oh, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for asking. Carl, I mean, without knowing it, we go way back because we intersect, I think, at least the Washington City paper is one point that we share in common. I'm not a DC native. I didn't grow up here, but I've been here for a long time and in journalism for a long time. So our paths have intersected and we got to know each other or met at a book festival in Florida, where we were both promoting our books from a couple of years ago. And I don't know about you, but I recall that I had a gin and tonic on the table at that time while we were selling our books. And I wanted to also commend you on your backdrop because I know you're not in a smoky bar, but it sort of has that smoky bar atmosphere that appears in a couple of my favorite scenes in your book. When you retreat, I think of them sort of as the low moments, perhaps spiritually, for you when you're retreating from the rallies. But they are among my favorite. I have so many favorite moments in the book, and I'm going to try to get to all of them. It's funny that we were just talking about DC because one of the things I wanted to ask you about, one of my favorite parts that comes up pretty soon in the book that it just was so evocative for me is when you talk about your DC upbringing and you talk about the way in which it prepared you and didn't prepare you for, what you would encounter in the Trump rallies. And I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit more, why it is that how your DC upbringing contrasted from what you would encounter in the Trump rallies. And also I hoped that you could give readers a taste of one aspect of DC culture that actually helps insinuate you with the core group of rally goers. I think you know what I'm talking about, but if you don't, I'll help when you.
I'm not sure. Well, I grew up in DC. I was born and raised. I went to DC public schools, K through 12, and I was just steeped in a world of politics and journalism. I mean, my parents met before I was born as two single people at Congressional Quarterly news magazine that I think CQ still exists, but it's probably digital. But in those days, it was the, sort of premier publication that covered Congress. And, my dad went on to work in the Washington Star and was assistant managing editor of the Star. And then he became editor of the National Journal, and then he worked on campaigns and went to the Hill. And so, I grew up in all of that. I mean, my parents were passionate about politics and liberal politics, and we were always just taught that, books and ideas mattered, and that the news mattered, and that the, journalists were good people, that journalism was good. It was the highest. That journalism and politics weren't some cynical thing, but they were really the highest calling. And that's how I grew up. And so everything that sort of happened in of the last few years was, the calling into question of journalism and of news were really counter to everything that I had grown up with. And, in a way, the reason I I went into journalism but I wasn't writing about politics because I felt like I had done it, kind of just lived it. But I don't know what you're talking about. The
moment. Okay, so one of the things that I identify with and admire so much is your ability to connect with the people who you encounter. Like every journalist knows the stress of getting to the place where you need to do your reporting, wondering if you're going to get the story, wondering if you're going to get anybody to talk to you, and how are you going to do it? How are you going to make that connection? Are they going to be willing to talk to you? And it turns out that one of the rally goers is familiar with a particular DC establishment that and so all this high-minded talk that you've just been engaging in about journalism and the life of the mind and stuff like that, that's not really how you make your connection with
right. Well, I drove to my first rally in Minneapolis, and I was very, very lonely in that rally. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anyone. I was just frantically texting my children and my friends, like, help. I felt like somebody that was being taken over by a cult or something. And then I went to Dallas, and I got there a little bit earlier, and I sort of felt the same way. Then I started to talk to people more. And in Dallas, I met this guy. I actually had seen him in Minneapolis. and he was wearing a suit, which is unusual in rallies because most people are in, MAGA gear. And he was hustling these little Trump buttons, very small, for $1. And there was something about him that just looked different from anyone. And so in Dallas, I started talking to him, and there was a seat that was empty next to me. This is the day before the rally, in line, downtown Dallas. And suddenly he just sat down and he said, I'm Richard Snowden, and I've been to more Trump rallies than anyone in history. He was on that day, it was 50-something rallies. But he said he was the owner, he was an entrepreneur. And I said, I was from Washington, D.C. He said, oh, I used to own a bar in Washington, D.C. And I said, oh, what was the name of it? He said, King Arthur's. And I just knew it was a strip joint. I don't know how I knew that, but it was just, I knew it. And I said, the strip joint? And he was like, oh, you know your city, don't you? He goes, I don't really talk about that anymore, because a lot of people don't approve it. I'm retired. I'm not in the business anymore. But when I we chit-chatted, he left. Then a couple days later, or a week later, I showed up in Tupelo, Mississippi at the rally, 50 some hours early. And I was the 6th person to arrive, and Rick Snowden was sitting there, and he recognized me from that conversation and said, hello, you're number 6 in line, take a seat. And that was sort of like, from then on, I was kind of like the made man.
Yeah, as I said, I just really admired how you managed to get to the front of the line and insinuate, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean that in a positive way, befriend and establish your bona fides with this group of people who, whose upbringing and outlook are very unfamiliar from yours. And just as, I guess, as a fellow reporter, you never know like where that connection is going to come from. And in your case, it came from your knowledge of the city. And in unexpected places. Not that you hung out there, but just that we passed them all on, K Street or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, it like so much of reporting. I mean, it's one thing if you sort of show up, or anything you do in life, really. If you just show up someplace and you walk in, it's one thing, but it's when you return and you come back and people see you over multiple times that they start to know you and sort of trust you. That's when things really happen. And it's the same way in all of my, when I went to, lived with the asthma in New Guinea, it was when I went back the second time, and and then I really just plopped down. Like when I lived in the village, it's the same. When I lived with the Trumpians from Tupelo on, really 2 days before, just hanging out, everything kind of changed and the world opened up in a way.
Well, that's actually leads to my next question, which is I was going to ask you the kind of reporting that you did for immersing yourself in the Trump rallies compared to the more far-flung assignments and reporting expeditions that you've taken on. What were the similarities between this reporting adventure versus prior ones? What were the similarities and what were the differences? What did you feel like in your experience prepared you to do this kind of immersive reporting? What was different?
I mean, honestly, it's absolutely the same. I think it doesn't really matter. I mean, being in a village in a 10,000 square mile swamp with no electricity, no plumbing, in Asmat with former headhunters is hard. It's hot, it's miserable, the food's bad, you can't speak the language, or I learned Indonesian, but badly, especially when I first went there, and I was struggling to communicate on all those things. And then on top of it, these people are wildly different. But ultimately, I think it's the same, and it's just trying to be, I don't go into these things and say, I give up everything. Kind of, I surrender completely. And, so I don't go to Asmat and say, I need food, I'm hungry, when are we eating, I need a better place to sleep. And they don't arrive at the Trump rallies saying, you guys are assholes, or, I think Trump's a fascist. I mean, I don't say those things. I just, you just sit with people and you communicate with people on one, I mean, I made friends. These people, the people I hung out with became friends, and I liked them. And, we couldn't really talk about politics, and that's a whole nother subject. But it was the same. I hung out with them and I spent time with them and I listened and we chatted about stuff and it was the same. And it's just being human and not being a jerk to people, kind of.
Yeah, I think you're downplaying your own abilities to do that and to befriend and to hang out. And some of the other favorite moments in my book are when there's a lot of conspiracy theorizing that you are exposed to in the book. You listen to a lot of people sharing wild conspiracy theories and other just off the wall ideas. And every now and then you do say to somebody, that is just bullshit. Like you will say that. Like sometimes you get pushed.
So it just comes out. It like
right.
explodes.
And at a certain point, you'll say, that's just not true. And yet you obviously have the ability to say it in a way that doesn't offend the person. Like almost never in those scenes does the person that you're talking to get offended when you say, well, that's just not true, because you convey it in such a way. I don't know, your moments of exasperation are also among my favorite moments.
Well, the thing is that one of the things I thought that going into this, that I would be having a lot of really interesting kind of substantive political conversations with people, and that, we would be talking about the advantages of conservatism versus liberalism and all of these things. And that wasn't true. Like it turned out you couldn't. And that, once in a while I said, like, there's this moment where toward the very end, I mean, there's an arc in the book where I'm sort of alone and lonely and trying to figure it all out in Minneapolis. And then I'm, in Tupelo, I become friends and I'm really rocking with it all. And in Florida, it's like we're sitting out in the sun in the parking lot and people are waving flags and it's great. And toward the end, the weather started turning bad and it became more difficult for me. And but there's a scene in there, there's a guy named Dave Thompson who I liked and who was so different from me. I mean, like radically different, very religious. And one day we were at the rail and he said something about the wall. And I said, I don't think the wall is such a great idea. Like, I don't, he was like incredulous. He's like, what do you mean you don't believe in the wall? How could you not believe in the wall? Like he was flabbergasted and I couldn't really, and then people start turning around. So there'd be these moments where I'd say, you couldn't really carry that conversation forward. You couldn't, because people were, the level of conspiracy theory and is so intense. And so people are just in a completely different place.
Right. That was one of the revelations for me about what you learned was that, as you point out, many of the rally goers, they're not even getting their worldview and their information from Fox News. They're getting it from all sorts of dark web conspiracy theory. It's beyond, way beyond Fox News, the ideas and fantasies that people are subscribing to.
Yeah, I mean, lately there's been kind of I've been seeing a lot of reports on QAnon and stuff, but I thought going into this that various conspiracy theories, and by that I mean QAnon, but also others. There's all kinds of crazy ones, and would be really tangential, fringe, Right. But I mean, almost everyone, not quite everyone, but almost everyone in one way or another believed in that stuff. And it was really hard. Like I met this woman in Dallas who was really nice. We were in line at the taco truck waiting for, the day before the rally. We ended up sitting next to each other and we've actually ended up chatting over text some after the rallies. And she was a really nice woman. She traveled, she'd been to India. I mean, she wasn't a country bumpkin or anything. And she said she had even supported Obama at some point. And I said to her, the thing that surprises me about all this is the number of conspiracy theories. Like, I'm surprised. And she said, well, yeah, I mean, I don't have 99 friends who committed suicide, do you? And I was like, wait, what? And then I realized that she meant like, Vince Foster and the Clintons murdering. And she said, Hillary would kill to win. Absolutely. And at one level or another, people believe all this stuff and they don't, going back to what you first started saying, people say to me, a frequent thing is, I don't I do my own research. And that means they look at Twitter and social media feeds, and they don't, they may not watch any Fox, they may not watch any, they certainly don't read the Post or the Times or even the Wall Street Journal or the Economist, newspapers that I think are conservative, but reliable.
Right. Right. Yeah. So as I said, that was a revelation to me, is how often that crept into, how often a conversation would start out in sort of a normal vein and then just veer into the land of wild conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and it's my belief that of the 40 million or whatever, whatever Trump's base is, that tens of millions of Americans actually believe in some level of conspiracy theory.
Right. That certainly comes through. But the other, speaking of sort of the media and where people are getting their information, one of the other, I think, insights that you found that surprised me is, for all the talk about the media and fake news, et cetera, that goes on in the rallies and all of the vilification of the mainstream media that you hear from the president in these rallies, the rally goers, you said, welcome you, welcome the media, love the media, want media attention.
Look, people are the same everywhere. People love attention. Right. They love the media. They come running. I mean, when the cameras come up, they run to the cameras. And it doesn't matter whether it's Fox or CBS or NBC or, MSNBC, they come running. They love it. And people were very nice to me. I mean, very unfailingly nice to me.
They were. Well, you were clearly nice to them, and willing to listen. And again, just as you say, hang out. But that was another really striking revelation. So meanwhile, readers are obviously going to get this when they read your wonderful book. And I should say, for everybody listening, your book reads like a drink of water. Reads just like a dream. People will sit down and they'll consume it all. It's so fluent and so beautifully written, and it just propels the reader along. The whole time that you're doing this reporting, you're going to rallies and you're hanging out, and you're waiting these long lines. It gives a very good flavor of what it's like, to wait for these events to start. You're also doing a lot of reading, and you're doing a lot of reading and thinking, and also at the very beginning, you're driving to the rallies, so you're spending a lot of time driving around the country. How did you balance the reading and thinking and immersing yourself in history and philosophy and political thought with the actual rally going? When were you doing each? And because it always seems like you're at a moment where just the right passage occurs to you.
Well, that's just because, I mean, as soon as I started really thinking about it, I started reading, and, reading as widely as I could. I mean, I was sort of grasping for anything. And then people recommend books. It was a friend of mine who said, "Oh, you have to read Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti." I never heard of Canetti. And I looked at that book and I thought, "Oh, this sounds amazing." And then I started reading it, and it was like, Canetti had fled fascism in Europe and had won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Literature Prize in I think 1981. And this book, Crowds and Power, it's like he's writing about Trump it's like he's speaking about Trump himself. I found it so incredibly relevant. And so, I'm reading all this stuff, and as you're reading, you become, obviously I don't hear Trump say something and then instantly think of the perfect passage, but I'm doing it all simultaneously. And as I read, I type passages in my computer. So I have these passages, I've thought of them, I remember them. And yeah, you see Trump doing something, or like there's this whole scene in New Hampshire where they, all of these people. And this is an amazing thing about Trump rallies. It's really a place where he sort of gets his power from. and all of the, like in Texas, there'll be Rick Perry and Ted Cruz and the whole GOP down ballot. And then in New Hampshire, I mean, there was everyone. There was, Jared and Ivanka and, Don Jr. and, his girlfriend. And then there was, Mitch McConnell and all these people, his court. And the longer the rallies went on, the larger his court went on. And he gets up and he says in the middle of his speech, he calls people up. He pauses and he says, he tells a story, and that story is always about how he defeated them. He humiliated them in some way, but now they're very loyal. And, he's holding these people out for the crowd, and he's saying, I can give you this. I can give you 22,000 screaming fans, or I could take it away. And, I just thought of Ryszard Kapuscinski's book on Haile Selassie, which I don't know if I was even reading it at the time, but I'm a fan of Kapuscinski. So, I thought of it, this scene, which I had in the recesses of my memory.
Yeah, and those scenes are really powerful when he's holding court, and also, being paid homage to by other politicians he's defeated. You talk about Ted Cruz and how Trump goes on and on about Cruz's debating skills, and the end point is that Trump beat him in the primaries, and so the
Not beat him, crushed him.
Crushed him,
That's
yeah.
what he always says. He says, what you come out of it is he crushed him.
Right. So talk about the rally goers, the ones you got to know, the ones you had glancing encounters with, and why they're there, what they're there for. What can you say about that?
Well, I think that I think in general, people are going to Trump rallies because, people love Trump. There's a large number, in particular, the classic, non-college, white, working class men and women who go with them, who love Trump. And they, when I say they love him, I mean, they really love him. I don't think, some people just don't grasp, like, you're in a rally and there's a moment of silence, and there's, a voice rings out, a deep, working class voice, I love you, or I was in the parking lot in Tupelo, Mississippi, and a guy who was working on the fencing, mid-60s male in a pickup truck, stopped, and we were all talking to him, and he said, I love that man. I would walk behind him and pick up his poop.
Right.
Which is an incredible thing to say, really. And I think there are a lot of people who feel the ground is shifting, and they feel, the age of being able to work with your hands and your back, and just, you don't need much education, and you can provide for your family, and the age of when the world was less secular, and the age when women weren't as powerful, and whites had a lot of privilege, and all of those things. That world is shifting, and I think they feel that, and Trump put words to that in a way that that almost nobody else has. And unfortunately, when you're, the subtitle of the book is "This Upside Down World," and it is. It's like he's putting words to it, but it's all topsy-turvy. It's all kind of wrong. And then in the people that I really hung out with, there's this huge social element to the rallies too. People love to go to the rallies. They love to sit. That's what we talked about the most. It was like getting there, getting out, where to find a spot, whether it was cold, what the weather, just all the logistics of hanging out for 50 hours in a parking lot.
Yeah, it seemed to me as though that was maybe for you and for all of them one of the high points of the reporting experience. You talk about just visiting back and forth, right? Because you're stuck there in line, and there's nothing else to do except be sort of entertained by some of the people who are there, right? It's funny because during the pandemic, we've kind of experienced that, right? Time slows down, and if you're around other people, you have more time to visit with them than you otherwise would. But you were experiencing that in line, where you're just kind of stuck there, and so you
Yeah, well, my mom is from North Dakota, was from North Dakota originally. And like, if we went back to Candu, the town where she was from, it would just crush me because it was so boring. We would go from house to house. And, it was 1,500 people live in this town. And we would go and we would just sit there and we would talk. I mean, I was a kid. And my mom said, we're visiting. And that's what I thought so much of the time in Trump's rallies were, sitting in the parking lot, was visiting, just old fashioned visiting.
And how did you end up kind of reconciling the likability of the people you were hanging out with, and the fact that you became friends with your, I think it's fair to say, complete alienation from what you were hearing, and it's not like you got co-opted or drawn into this in any way. So how do you reconcile people's likability with their just complete?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question that goes to the heart of so much of what's happening right now, where people are like, today I was on Twitter and there were some people really just like some right-wing people, started just on me, and there was, the vitriol was so intense, like non-human, and these people killing each other now.
Yeah.
And so that's the essential question. I mean, I think that I felt that the people I was hanging out with were humans, and that they were enjoyable and they were kind and they were nice, even though they supported a man who I think is a racist and is a misogynist and is destroying this country and or trying to, and who doesn't believe in law. I mean, all he believes in is himself, and who is clearly corrupt and all those things. And how do you reconcile that? I don't really know. People, I don't know. In the end, in the book, I blame Trump and the people I think who should know better. The Mitch McConnells of the world, who are educated and readers, and theoretically they should know better. But then in the end, and I say, if we're going to be sympathetic, why can't we be sympathetic to all of these people who feel adrift? And then I kind of go, wait a minute, why don't we hold them responsible? These people, why can't they go find different jobs and move to cities where there's more employment? And I mean, it's sort of an intractable issue, and I don't know where we go with it, to be honest.
And you do talk about moments where, even in this bubble of very like-minded people, and because they're like-minded, there's not going to be the kind of conflict that there is on the streets now, but you witness moments of racism for sure, that you talk about. And, the gender piece of it, I don't know so much. Most of the people that you're hanging out with in line, who are the sort of hardcore rally goers, are men.
Yeah, for sure. I spent a lot more time with men. I mean, I was sort of bowled over by the number of women who were at rallies, and who were, the women can be incredibly vociferous Trump supporters. And, but I feel like there are a lot of women who, kind of buy into much more old-fashioned ideas of gender roles, and they support, and there's probably a lot of incongruities in all of these things. We're stereotyping and generalizing. So, but there's a lot of women who are, probably working and, have to working outside of the home. They're not just sitting there at home, but yet they believe their men should be their role is to cook and to knead the shoulders of their men after a hard day's work. And that, and then the flip side of that, I mean, like, if you look at the sort of Trumpian women's outfit, like what Kaylee wears, and Ivanka, with the clothes they wear, it's these sort of these weird tight dresses with fake eyelashes and blonde hair, and it's kind of throwback clothing, it seems to me.
So by and large, that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, very much. I mean, yeah.
And so before I move to questions, just the one other thing that really struck me, because you were able to, fortunately, and props to you, get this reporting done before COVID shut the rallies down. But it is starting to happen when you're at your last rally or getting toward the last rally. And so we can see how things are going. And you have a chapter in your book in which you talk about the pandemic, but you also very astutely say that you think that he'll return to the rallies, that Trump will return to the rallies before November, as soon as he can, which is what happens. And I was lucky to read your book at Galleys a couple months ago, and then I was reading it again before this event, and thinking about it so much during the Republican convention, and particularly the last night of the convention and the crowd of 1,500 people out in the open air, mostly without masks, and so it seems like you foresaw that he was going to try to start holding rallies again.
Well, he has to. I mean, rallies are essential to his power. My first rally in Minnesota, when he came out, I was kind of bowled over. I mean, this was a total surprise to me. He seemed powerful. He seemed big and powerful. He is a big man. I mean, you don't realize how big. He's 6'4" something, and now 300 pounds. I mean, he's big. You can tell he looks big. And I was very close to him. And he's commanding in this sort of, and he's relaxed, and he's telling stories, and he's, speaking in falsettos, and he looks powerful in this sort of Mobutu-like big man power way. And I feel like we saw that at the convention, and again, he even went after the convention up to New Hampshire. He's starting to speak again, and he's like a balloon with a hole in it. This is the way I think of it, and there's nothing there, and the crowd fills him up, and the more there is, the bigger he gets, and he feels big and he looks big, and without that, he diminishes. He becomes smaller. And that's like he's been flailing the last, couple months in COVID times without this adoring, screaming audience. And then as soon as he gets it, you get scared. You look at him and you think, oh, he's getting big, because you can see him getting big again.
Yeah. So that all really comes across when you evoke the rallies and talk about how the pandemic is affecting the sort of the zeitgeist there. So to move to some of the questions in the chat, and I hope people will continue to send them, because I'm scrolling through and they're really good questions. One of the questions just has to do with, and there's no negative connotation here. She's just wondering if you misrepresented yourself in order to become closer to the people you were hanging out with, and did anybody ever ask you what you believe or what your political viewpoint is?
Yeah. At first, I wasn't sure what to do. Like when I went to my first rally, I mean, my intention was never to misrepresent myself, but I didn't know what level. But the only way, 90% of what I do is take notes. So the minute I took my notebook out, there's a certain point you can say, hi, how are you? But as soon as people start talking, saying something interesting, I got to take notes or else I won't remember. So I'd start taking notes. And then, of course, that busted me right away. And, people would say, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm writing a book on Trump's rallies. And sometimes that was all I said, that I said. And if people asked the follow-up question, well, then they'd say, well, why are you writing a book on Trump's rallies? And I'd say, well, because Trump has held more rallies than any other president, and they're integral to who he is and his administration. And people got that, like they agree with that. And then people would say, well, so where do you what are your politics? And I would say, for the purposes of the book, of this reporting, I'm trying to be, I'm just sort of watching. And I said, I'm here to listen.
Yeah.
which was largely true. I mean, it's not that I was there to be convinced or that I thought I was going to be convinced, but I was there to listen, and that's what I did. I mean, you don't get people, you don't say, well, that's bullshit, or that's not true, and get people to and get to be friends with people. I agree. But the thing is that the really interesting thing, I think, is that I spent a lot of time, 100, almost 170 or something hours, mostly with the same people. And over time, like, you can't be anyone but yourself. So, I think most of them sort of began to understand. And once in a while I would say, that's not true, or I don't like the wall, or, different. I mean, one, a guy named Rick Frazier I became quite good friends with, and I think he's watching tonight, and, he knew completely that I'm a liberal. And then, others, it became evident, I think, and then some maybe just didn't ask the question. But I was never false, I don't think, or I certainly didn't mean to be.
That doesn't come across that you were ever false. And I think I mean, there are 4 or 5 moments where you, as I said, you get exasperated, and you just, at one point, like, you put your hand on somebody's shoulder and you say, that's just bullshit. And it's a charming moment.
Everybody's been texting me lately.
One listener wants to know, is there a theme? Is there a common theme to the conspiracies? And is there any association with fact?
With what?
Fact.
I would say there's no association with fact, and there's a common theme. I mean, no, not really. I mean, QAnon or all of a certain, there's a lot of the wall is being built to stop child predators, and that there's a whole class of pedophiles, John Podesta, Hillary Clinton, who are raping or drinking the blood or something, which rolls into Pizzagate, because that's what was happening in the basement of the pizza joint. But then Hillary Clinton and the suicide. So I mean, that's not really QAnon. And then it goes in every direction. I mean, it's like what Trump said today about the plane full of people in black clothes who were, I mean, what is that related to? It's all just complete fantasy.
So we have, looking at other questions, here's one. People can believe that Blacks and other people of color are lower forms of humanity and be nice to them at the same time. How did rallygoers rationalize Trump's racism?
Well, they say they're not racist. I mean, the first thing that it's very quick in a conversation. If you start talking about that, they'll say, the Democrats, the liberals all call us racist, and I'm not a racist. We're not racist. And, the first rally I went to in Minneapolis, I went trying to find the sort of front of the line the day before in the afternoon before, and I found it. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I found it, and there were like 20 people. My book actually begins in that section, and there was a black man in a MAGA hat and a Sergeant Stripes kind of baseball shirt, and I was shocked. I was like, wow, I didn't expect that. And then I went the next morning as the line grew and thousands showed up. I was sort of struck by the number of Black people, and but then when you realize it's like, maybe there's 100 or 200 out of 20,000, you realize it's an all-white, for all practical purposes, it's an all-white crowd. And eventually there's all kinds of people. I mean, at a Trump rally, you see everyone. I mean, there's LGBTQ people carrying signs, LGBTQ for Trump, and there's Jews for Trump, and there are Blacks for Trump, and there are Latinos for Trump, but they're incredibly small numbers, and they're literally tokenized by the campaign. They'll take, for instance, guide as many Black people as they can into the seats directly behind the president, because that's where the TV cameras are looking, and they'll give them T-shirts that say "Blacks for Trump." And it's the same thing. It's what Trump says. I've done more for Black people than any president in history, and what do you have to lose? That's what he says. And even though, and that's part of the fantasy. I mean, a Trump rally is a fantasy. It's a Trump, not just a rally, but to me, everything about him is a fantasy. He's for working class people, right? I mean, he's for union people, but he's, the GOP has been systematically trying to destroy right to work, pass right to work laws for decades. I mean, over the tax cuts are for rich people, not, over and over again. It's just a flipped world.
Several listeners asked the same question. I wonder about the issue of race and your ability to ingratiate yourself with this particular crowd. I don't mean to imply that they only identify with white or Caucasians, but would a Black person have been able to elicit the kind of responses that you received?
I mean, I can't say, but there are, if you were a Black person and you went and you were wearing a MAGA hat and you sat down in the line and you were like, hey, I love Trump, they would pat you on the back and they would welcome you in, most people. I mean, they wouldn't say, but the question would be, what happens if there were 10,000 Black people who came to a rally and they wanted something? Like, those singular people. I mean, look, racism in the end is about power. I mean, always. And so if you don't threaten the power and you don't want power, then it's okay to an extent. But it's when, you suddenly start to threaten, to reduce someone's privilege or, to gain power, then it's perceived as a threat. So as long as, it's an overwhelming, make America great again. What does that mean? What does that mean? America was, what's that mean? It means in part when you're at a Trump rally, it's a white world. And even though but that's the nature of racism too. It's systemic racism. So, individuals can be, not everyone who's a racist is a KKK person, but, you can be perfectly civil to, your Black neighbor and invite him over even sometimes. But, it's a different ball game if there's power.
And I think related to the questions that these listeners are asking, there's one of the most troubling moments, I think, in the book is when there's a Black woman who asserts that she was there waiting in line the night before and that she should have a place high up in the line. And all of these people say, no, we've never seen her before. And you talk about how the fact that they literally claim to have not seen her, and seen in every sense, acknowledge or.
Yeah, it was really weird and spooky for me to watch that. I mean, later she turned out to be someone who kept appearing at Trump rallies, and she was a bit of a provocateur in some ways, but I could never figure out who she was. But it kind of didn't matter to me. Like what I saw, I was there the night before, and she was there. I mean, we were all there, and we all spent the night there, but we all also went back to our cars or our hotel rooms for, whether it was 2 to 5 hours to get some warmth and shut-eye. And nobody thought anything of us coming or going and leaving and coming back. But I had seen her, and then, so she was in the top, 100 probably, no question about it. And, maybe 150. And the next morning, or, like 11 o'clock, and the line was big by then. And she returned, and these women who were also, I had seen the night before, we were all been right there, were completely like, no, honey, get out of this line. You were not here. And, people were going, she wasn't here. And I had seen her here.
Yeah. That to me was one of the scariest and starkest moments in the book. Mm-hmm. Somebody else asks, if asked, what advice would you give to Joe Biden in his campaign based on your experiences and your writing this book?
Well, that's a little outside of I still think that the Democrats need to address these people. and address their needs in some way, their anxieties. And that, there's a part in the book where I talk about, Hillary Clinton and coal mining, and the line about we're going to do away with mining jobs, which was the way she said it was wrong. I mean, mining jobs are going, underground coal mining jobs are disappearing. It doesn't matter what anyone, Trump has tried to stimulate Appalachian coal, and it's not really working for reasons that are out, for economic reasons and climate reasons, but those jobs are really, I've spent a lot of time, in jungles, but I also have been in underground coal mines and on deep water oil rigs, and spent a lot of time with, blue collar people. And, there's no comparison with those jobs. I mean, a man who works in a coal mine or in a factory, and who or in a steel mill, and who slaves and works with his hands and his back, feels good about himself and makes enough money to support a family. And there's no, especially something like coal mining that's so dangerous. Those people come out of the mines and they're heroes, really. And that's why there's songs written about miners, there are movies, there are books, there's literature written about coal mining. And, to suddenly just diss it shows a huge lack of understanding about what makes human beings whole, and what has made a lot of Americans feel whole for a lot of years. And there are forces at work that have nothing, and in my opinion, there are forces at work that have nothing to do with, with liberal or conservative policies. I mean, mechanization and technology and all of these things, but, those issues have to be addressed, and those people's lives matter. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, I think the Democrats have to be cognizant of those people. I don't think, there's anything he could say or do that would make, 30 million Trump people suddenly come over to the Democrats in the next 60 days. But over time, I think that needs to be addressed.
So looking at some of the other questions, there are several questions sort of to this effect. Given your insights into the cult of Trump, if he continues to maintain that the election will be rigged by the deep state, do you think it's possible that we will see people take arms, and will there be anti-government violence in the streets? Do you think there could ever be another civil war? A related question to that is, I'm curious what you think about the future of democracy now that you went inside MAGA rallies. That's from a college friend, Gail. But generally, a lot of questions about, well, what's going to happen now? And I think the first question that I read is assuming that the election doesn't go the way Trump wants it to go, and that he maintains that it's rigged. Will we see people take arms, and will there be violence in the streets? What do you think?
I really can't answer that question. I don't know. If you'd asked me a couple weeks ago, even, I would have said no. But events over the last week, in Kenosha and Portland have frightened me a little bit more. I think, and what the president is saying, you can, at the end of the day, he's fanning the flames, and it's frightening. And I don't know. There are all these issues. There's the issue of violence. There's the issue of, mail-in voting, and what happens if it's close? What happens if there's another election like 2016, except that, there are all these mail-in votes that take time to be counted. What happens with Trump? All those things are big. I don't know. I will say that if Trump is elected, my reading of Trump through the rallies is that he's, at heart, he's somebody who has no ethics and no morals, and he has no understanding of history or anything, any of the really big, important strains of American history, and that he will move more and more toward an authoritarian way, and that he can't, because he can't help himself, and that, you know, everything that's happened with, you know, the Justice Department and Mueller and Ukraine and all of those things are just, you know, maybe even a tip of the iceberg that we've seen, and that he will continue to do it. I mean, I think there's this, Kennedy really nailed it, that you know, I think that Trump has to kill to win. And he has to kill, you know, the only true subject is the dead subject. And I mean that metaphorically. So, you know, after he killed Ted Cruz, now Ted is a subject, and that, you know, if you go against Trump, you get flattened. And that's the only way. There's only two outcomes, to triumph or to, and no one's triumphed yet. And no one, he won't allow that. So by definition, you know, he would be, you know, I think he's a threat to American democracy.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question. Did you meet any of the elusive undecideds at the rallies, or were folks fully on board with Trump?
Nobody I met at a Trump rally was undecided.
Huh.
No. I mean, there were a couple people who I met who said, oh, you know, maybe they were sort of undecided. I wouldn't say undecided, but they were curious. A very few people, like, you know, a couple, but, you know, I don't even know what they left the rallies thinking. I mean, you know, 99.9% of people who go to a Trump rally, you know, it takes a lot of work to go to a Trump rally, because you have to, you know, because they give as many tickets, an unlimited amount of tickets out. You know, anyone can get a ticket, and then, you know, to get in, you got to basically suffer and sit there for, you know, hours. It takes a lot of work, and people drive for hours and fly for days, and you know, there's a lot of suffering. I think that's part of it too. And if you really go to the rail, that's like, you know, you know, it's hard, physically hard, demanding, and that intensifies it.
So here's a question. I think you've answered the first part of the question, although feel free to elaborate. And we haven't really addressed the second part. The question is, did you see many Black rally goers? And did you see any open carry of firearms?
Well, as I said, I mean, you see, you know, you might see 100 Black people at a rally.
Right.
Maybe a big,
I feel like
you
you've
know,
addressed, yeah.
there's 200 in Minneapolis, which is an urban, you know, venue. Maybe there's a couple hundred. In a place like Bossier City, Shreveport, there's, you know, there were none. I mean, there were some. There's always some, but there are almost none. And as for open carry, well, you know, you can't bring a weapon into a Trump rally.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You can't. Anyone would be taken away, which is ironic. I mean, you know, don't we all need a weapon to protect us? You know, anyway, but, you know, needless to say, you cannot bring, you know, you can't bring a weapon, you can't bring your own sign, you can't bring a flag. You know, Trump rallies are very tightly controlled.
Yeah. Okay. That's because there are a fair number of questions about, you know, violence and whether or not.
I never saw any violence. I mean, there is a whole protocol for dealing with protesters in rallies, and you know, they say there's a jumbotron that is set up in the parking lots of Trump rallies, and it goes on about 7:30 a.m. on the rally day, and it plays on about an hour-long loop until you get into the rally. And, you know, part of that is always a thing about protesters. You know, if you see one, surround them, cover them with your signs, because you can't bring your own sign, but they give you signs, and say Trump, 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 Trump. And then, you know, the security comes in. There's private security, very large, big muscled people who come in, and then they take those people out. And, you know, one day in Hershey, Pennsylvania, often those break out, and, you know, you're not even really aware of them. I mean, unless they're close to you, you can't see. It all happens very fast. But in Hershey, this woman, sort of was on the floor, and she came out and appeared, and she got in this sort of weird little no man's land right near the stage. That's kind of a VIP area. And and it took a while for that, and she was sort of running around in it, you know, going like this with both hands to Trump, very close to him. And it was this moment. It was like, you know, 20 seconds right there. This little tiny pixie-ish woman challenging him, and he, you know, this cloud came across his face. But then she was surrounded and hustled off. So I never saw any real outright violence. I mean, not to say it you know, outside there are protesters and everything, but I never really saw it.
So we're just about at the end of the talk, and this may be the last question, and it sort of brings us back to the beginning, because it's a tribute to your dad and to other journalists of his generation, saying, Carl, Bert Hoffman, George Lardner, Bill Grider, we've lost some great lions. If they were with us today, would they have made a difference? Or is the press terribly weakened? So that, I think, raises the question of the media today. And
no, I don't think they, you know, they were, those people were all good journalists, and they were stalwart liberals, but there's plenty of good journalists working today. And I think they would be in, you know, speak with admiration again about all the people who are working today. I mean, there's nothing special about them, I don't think.
Well,
yeah.
That's related to that. I'll just work in one more question. Someone asks, since so many people's minds have been twisted and polluted by content on the internet, is there any case to be made for shutting down such content?
I don't know. I don't even know how to me, that's a really complicated question. And I don't know how to answer it. I mean, you know, issues of First Amendment rights, and I don't know. I wish I feel a little bit that I should maybe have a better answer, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I would say myself, I mean, it's not your job to answer that question. You're not taking that on, that sort of pundit role, and which is a wonderful quality of your book. But your book certainly does illustrate that people are getting their information and their beliefs from all sorts of, you know, unorthodox and dark corners of the web, and so we do see the consequences of it. And you set out to illustrate that, and you did so just in absolutely riveting, vivid, beautifully written prose. And so everybody ought to run. It's too bad we can't all be here in person together with you signing books right there, but
I'm really
everybody
sad that we can't see everyone. We can't, you know. But
yeah.
Another time. Well, thank you very much, Liza, and everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Brad. And I always feel a little embarrassed saying this, but buy the book, you know, that's how we make our living. And I really appreciate it. I can't do this if I don't get paid to come to Politics and Prose to talk. I just make my living off of selling books. So, you know, buy Liza's book, Code
much
Girl.
marked up copy, please. But yeah.
Bye-bye.
Well, we all have copies. Yeah, thanks, Carl and Liza, for really a truly fascinating and revealing discussion. Carl, you really have to be commended for keeping your wits about you in the upside down world, as you call it, of Trump's rallies. Again, the title of Carl's book is Liar's Circus, and you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we've posted in the chat column. And thanks again to everyone who tuned in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you so much, everyone. Liza, Brad, thank you.
Happy Pub Day.